On this episode, I'll discuss Aesop's Fables. What are they and why do they matter? Welcome back to the podcast. My name is R.E. On this episode, Aesop's Fables. What are Aesop's Fables and why do they matter? Do they matter? So Aesop's Fables are a collection of fables credited to Aesop, a slave and a storyteller who is believed to have lived in ancient Greece a couple thousand years ago. And these fables were passed down orally through centuries before actually written down. And not all the fables that are attributed to him in this book, in this series, in this collection, were actually written by him. And that is an important thing to just think about because these stories were passed down orally for centuries. They could have been passed down to him, and so it's not always about the messenger. That's a good lesson to start with. It's not always about the messenger, it's about the message. So what exactly is a fable? A fable is a story that isn't true, that you really know that isn't true, a short story, and it usually involves some type of magical elements, such as animals talking to each other, and it's meant to teach a specific lesson. One specific lesson. It's basically short fiction, short fantasy meant to point to and teach the truth. And I think these matter because these stories are a very effective way to teach somebody a lesson. And I think that we learn best by stories. We learn best by entertainment. And these stories are pretty entertaining. They're kind of silly, but also if you think about how they were written thousands of years ago, or even orally passed down thousands of years ago before they were actually written, I think you can see kind of the power of how these have shaped kind of the moral ground and the political ground that we stand on in our minds. And these stories can really teach any type of lessons, ethical lessons, spiritual, religious, political, just how to be a better person according to the author. And the general structure of these stories is that there's a short introduction, then followed by the quick story, what actually happened, and then a 1 or 2 sentence moral at the end that teaches you the intended lesson. And it's important to note that there are many translations of Aesop's Fables. There are many translations in many different cultures and many different languages. And that may lead to different meanings, and that is okay, and that is great. That shows that the diversity of these things, how they're reaching different cultures and affecting people differently, and people will always have their own interpretations about anything. And some famous ones, if you've heard of any of these, you may have heard of Aesop's Fables before. I know that I had never really heard of any of these other than the tortoise and the hare. A lot of people have heard about the tortoise and the hare. Other famous ones of Aesop's Fables that I will go into in this series are the goose that laid the golden eggs, the lion and the mouse, the wolf and the crane, the fox and the grapes. These kind of sound like Dr. Seuss books. Maybe Dr. Seuss was inspired by these, maybe not. But the book that I'm going to be using throughout this series, and I'm going to be going through hopefully all of them, or at least the ones that I find entertaining and engaging that teach a lesson, are basically, there are 284 of them in this book that I'm using. And I'm using the Canterbury Classics edition, translated by V.S. Vernon Jones, but there are many more than these 284. And we'll see how many I actually end up going through. But I think this is a perfect way to start a series on this podcast where obviously the goal of this podcast, making it fun to learn about emotional intelligence, self-love, and mental health. And I think that these stories all teach a very valuable lesson in this way. So, and I also think that I'm going to start getting into fable writing, and I think that this will help me as well. But I think this will also help teach people in a different way, and it may also engage a different audience that didn't like the other way that I was going about this podcast. Just not to say it's different, but this is more going to be using my own commentary and just talking about these stories that have already existed and have influenced many generations of the world. So that, in a short nutshell, is what Aesop's Fables are, why they matter, teaching short, important lessons through interesting and engaging and magical type of stories. And I hope you come along the ride for the series that I am about to start going through some of these.